Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Jira Align session. We have Mark Cruth with us, and we have 5 cities joining this event, which is Pune, Bangalore, Hong Kong, Kuala Lumpur, and Visakhapatnam. And we also have leaders from each of these cities joining us. You can chat with them in the chat box. So some basic rules before we start. Please keep yourselves on mute while you are attending the session. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we can take it up towards the end of the session, right, Mark? That will work, right?
That works for me.
Sure. So just be on mute, keep adding your questions as and when you have it, and we'll make a note of all those questions and we'll try to answer in the remaining time that we have. With that, I would like to introduce Mark. Mark is a senior enterprise solution architect with our Atlassian, and he's an agile advocate since 2009, and he has made a mission that these values and principles of agile are put into everything that he does. So we are very happy to have Mark, and learning what Jira Align is and how we can build enterprise agility from Mark himself would be like a great learning platform for all of us. So keep asking questions because there are some giveaways also towards the end. So keep asking those questions. I'm taking notes and I'll be giving out some giveaways later in the emails to all those who are engaging during the session. So with that, Mark, over to you. And yeah, that's over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction and hi, folks. Nice to meet you all. So again, Mark Cruth, I'm a solutions architect, and what that means is that most of my day job is actually working with customers to actually help them kind of connect practice and tooling. It means taking products like Jira Align and working with the customer says, you know what, we're trying to do this thing at scale. How could Jira Align help us? So that's what a lot of my day job is. I'm located out of the U.S. and just outside of Detroit, and yeah, I'm super excited to be here. First question I have for y'all, and this will just get you familiar with some of the functionalities in Zoom too. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a little reaction button. I want you to click that, and I want you to go in there, and if you have used Jira Align before, I want you to, or have seen it, I want you to hit the little green check. If you haven't, I want you to hit the little red X, and that'll pop up on my screen for me. So go ahead, hit that button. Let's see where everyone's at on here. We got a couple people, looks like we got at least someone who's seen it. A lot of people who this will be your first time, so I'm excited. I'll make sure I show you all the good bells and whistles here as we're going. So this kind of gives me an idea of where we're at. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I've got a little deck, and I get just a little one because I want to give you some context, and then we're going to jump into the real thing, which is the demo, and that's where I want to be able to show you the product, walk you through the storyline, those kind of fun things. So let me go ahead and share out my screen. All right, and you should see the word Atlassian. Do we see that? Beautiful. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we've got going on here. So today I do want to talk about enterprise agility and how Jira Align really helps that. And because really what it comes down to is Jira Align to me is a tool that is built with intention. It's built with the idea of agility in mind versus trying to be something to everybody. And so because of that, Jira Align is really the only platform for scaling agile to the enterprise. It's one of those things where it was born and raised as a tool that's designed to say, hey, we're going to try to take some practices that we know work in industry and instantiate that through a product and connecting it to team tools like Jira and so forth. And so you'll see that as we go through there, that there is very intentional design. Some of my customers will say, well, Jira Align doesn't really work for me. It doesn't help me do X, Y, and Z. And my usual question is, well, what are your goals for X, Y, and Z? And in the end, it comes down to what are you trying to achieve around enterprise agility, the X, Y, and Z is doing. And 9 times out of 10, we find that, oh, that might actually be an anti-pattern, or you know what, we actually are trying to do this, which is actually accomplished in this other means. So again, I always go back to Align is built as that scaling platform for an organization when they think about agility. Now, let's talk a little bit about what agile at scale means, just so that we're all on the same page. So as we're seeing it in the product, you're going to see the connection. You're going to see that intentional design. So for me, Jira Align kind of lives across what I consider 4 layers of scale. Technically, the tool supports 5, but we're not going to talk about the 5th layer. That's an optional layer. But really what it does is it talks about levels of granularity, levels of strategy versus execution. And so the very top of this kind of chain is always going to rest at the overall enterprise. This is where strategy actually comes from. This is where your C-suite, the business parts of your organization come together and says, what are we going to try to accomplish? What's the hill we're trying to take right now in our essentially our battle to be able to become the best in our industry? Here you'll see people, like I said, executives, finance, other groups who are out there essentially attempting to identify where they want to go as an organization. But the thing is, at this level, we don't really have any idea of how we're going to get there. We have some ideas, we have some objectives, but how do we actually instantiate that? And that's where you start getting into areas such as what we consider the portfolio lens. So portfolio is all about taking strategy and mapping it to execution through the aspects of hypothesis creation, through funding, these sorts of elements. Think of it as your enterprise identifies where they want to go. They also had to allocate a certain level of funding, and then portfolios are the ones that says, cool, I see where you're trying to go. I'm going to take that funding, I'm going to work with series of teams to be able to figure out how we might get there. This is where you see folks like a PMO might exist here. We typically have folks who are owning these large initiatives. Some organizations will have epics at this level, or portfolio epics. Some of organizations will have initiatives. These are things that are big chunks of work that are taking lots of investment to be able to actually manifest that strategy. Now, as you go through that, again, we're still not talking too much about the actual execution yet. It's still strategizing, just at a little granular level. When we get to the first level of execution, this is where we get to what is called the program or the team of teams level. This is where actually work gets organized and actually value is realized. One thing I like to say is that the first level that customers see value is at the team of teams, because it's typically the manifestation of multiple on the ground teams worth of work, putting things together to actually provide something that is valuable for a customer. Think of it as a large feature or functionality. Typically one team may deliver it, but it may require multiple. So it's that manifestation that realizes this. This is where that coordination comes in to basically say, working back with a portfolio, what are we trying to accomplish? Now let's turn it into actually something. Let's say turning into something tangible. And this is where you'll see that coordination. If you're familiar with things like Scaled Agile Framework, these sorts of things, you're going to notice this pattern is very similar. This is where we would say things like, if you do practice safe, you're talking with release train engineers here. Let's say you're doing Scrum at scale. The meta sync that happens is kind of happening at this level. Each framework kind of has its own kind of construct of a team of teams, and so for us, we're deeming it the program for all intents and purposes. Now, the final layer we have here is really what it's all about, because in the end, program, portfolio, and enterprise is all about essentially going through and figuring out where we want to go and making sure we have the best plan possible. But all plans are great without execution, you're going nowhere. So that last layer is that team layer. That team layer is where the work gets done. And that is where our teams come together and they actually produce something in the end. And again, it's that collection of those things that produces value. What I like to say here is that, teams are going to keep working. They're going to keep doing the stuff they do best. But if we're not thinking about the direction that we're providing, the vision, the strategy, they're just going to build wherever they need to build, and it's not necessarily going to be something valuable. So really, the program, portfolio, and enterprise are all layers of the organization that are designed to ensure that when that team is doing work, they're going in the right direction. We know we're going to make an impact in everything we do. So keep this in mind, because you're going to see this pattern play out in Align. Now, one more slide I want to show you before I get into my demo is this slide, and it talks about the 3 major elements that you're going to see in Jira Align. And really, regardless of Jira Align, it's 3 major elements of any kind of large scaling initiative. And that is the constructs of people, work, and time. We've already talked a little bit about the people element. You can see here where we kind of look at things like enterprise, portfolio, program, and team. This is that construct of how we organize around work. Now, this may not be our enterprise hierarchy, it may not be our reporting structure, but it represents essentially how we team together. We'll have that construct of teams. Teams come together to become teams of teams. Teams of teams come together with other teams of teams, potentially represent parts of a portfolio, and so forth. So you can see how that structure starts to manifest itself upwards in terms of how we organize around value. Now, within each of those layers, we actually have a construct of actual value being created, and that's going to be the work. And so at the very top of our organization, it's strategy. What's that big thing we're trying to take on? But the thing is, it's hard to get our arms around that. So for us, we start breaking that down. Within Align, you're going to see this. We have constructs such as themes that can play out. With a theme can break down into things like epics. And these are things the portfolio will manage. These are large chunks, but they're becoming much more tangible than a strategy. When you get down to the program level, those epics break down into features. And then from those features break down into stories. So the idea is that you get more levels of granularity as you get down towards the team. So that way, 1, once the team is working on things, there can be short feedback loops. But then 2, you can take that work item and follow it all the way back up to the strategy it's impacting today. The final element here is this construct of time, and you're going to see this heavily in Align as well, is that for us, when we think about time is this idea of feedback loops. It's forms of different levels of sprints at some level. As you imagine, teams work potentially as Kanban teams, so indefinitely, but in more of a throughput base. Or you might see more of that Scrum-based model where you're seeing sprinting every 2 weeks we're going. Well, regardless of Scrum or Kanban, when you move to the program level, we want to keep that construct of kind of time boxes that kind of like sprint and readjust, sprint and readjust. And this is where you start seeing things like program increments or quarters start playing into place, where a team of teams comes together and they plan that out. They say, hey, what are we going to do over the next 3 months or next 10 weeks? Beyond that PI or that quarter, you start moving into a portfolio and an enterprise realm, which might be dealing with multiple quarters. For that, we call those strategic snapshots. We may look at 4 quarters in a year and say, what are we trying to do this year? And then as you can imagine, if you know what you're going to do this year, you can break that out down into PIs or quarters, which break down into sprints. And again, you get that granularity. So for us, this is that kind of model to think about. So keep this in the back of your minds because you're going to see this manifest as we're getting into the product. So that's enough with slides, right? Let's go ahead and let's actually take a look at the product. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move us over. All right, let me just refresh my screen, make sure I'm all set. So first off, welcome to Jira Align. This is your landing page that you're going to come across as you enter into the product. And a couple things I'll orient you to as we're in here. For us, as we deal with things, you're going to notice that, remember, people, work, and time. From a people perspective, we organize our left-hand nav today around those elements. You can see we have enterprise, we have portfolio, we have program, we have team. We see those elements up here. This will help us determine what functionality we want to use at each one of those levels. I'm going to be using a different set of tools at an enterprise level than I am at a team level. Now, also with this at the top navigation, this is where we start looking at the type of data we're looking at. And this is where we start talking about the type of work and the time. Here, there's going to be an element of organization. Right now, we've got a digital services portfolio. So that when we look at a portfolio, we're starting to look at themes, epics, stories, features, all those sorts of things. But I can also come down to a team level or a program level here. And then finally, you see this element of time. Time is going to be something that allows me to aggregate my data here. So right now I'm looking at PI5. Best way I like to think about this is it's like a massive pivot table. I can select the data I want to see and then be able to look at it from the lens of what part of the organization I'm from. So I want to kind of walk you through a narrative here today in terms of how this works. Kind of walk you through the story of how an idea becomes an objective that becomes a work that ultimately reflects itself back up to an objective. And to do that, I'm actually going to use another piece of functionality in Jira Align. It's called a checklist. We have this neat little functionality where if you click on this little clipboard up here on the top right, you're able to build out a series of custom checklists. Anyone can do it in Align, and I'm going to use my ACE demo checklist. And what this does is it gives me the ability to essentially customize a flow that I might want to walk through. And so this is going to be our flow today. This is going to be me kind of walking you through a series of different pages within Align so you can kind of get the idea. So kind of handy as we're going. So let's go ahead. Excuse me. Let's go ahead and start taking a look here. And we're going to start at the first stop in our journey. And that's going to be at the start of anything. And that's starting at strategy. We can all begin working at something right away, but without strategy, we're just doing work. We're just doing busy work. So let's go ahead and click on Start with Strategy. And where this is going to do, this is going to take us to what we call our strategy room. I'm actually going to add a little bit more time to this. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select a strategic snapshot. So remember that construct, that larger period of time for an organization? This is one of those elements that comes into play. So let's take a look at what we have here. So this is our strategic snapshot for across these PIs, and particularly within this program, but also within its parent portfolio. We're looking at the digital services enterprise. And what you get presented with here is kind of neat. This is your one-stop shop for your leaders to be able to go in and say, one, let's make sure we're always right aligned to our mission, vision, and values. But more importantly, let's understand how much work is fitting into our current strategic snapshot. In this case, we've got 5 different themes that are fitting in here. We've got 14 portfolio epics, 11 features. We've also got a series of objectives and goals. What this means is that these are all the things, when we think about this period of time, these are all the things that are impacted in this period. And I'll show you how you can kind of take a deeper look at those. You can also get a snapshot of how things are actually progressing over here. Again, for us, we don't really care about at a leadership level getting into the nitty-gritty details. We just need to get a general sense of how things are progressing. And so for us, we'll give you an idea of against how's our execution against outcomes as we think about things like the themes associated with the goals, the features associated with the program objectives. And then you'll also be able to see an understanding of just overall progress of work items. As you can see here, we've got 133 of our 361 dependencies resolved right now. Well, that's pretty good. We've also started making progress. We're probably about 2/3 of the way there with our stories. About 2/3 of our way, a third of our way there on features and so forth. You can start getting a picture about overall progress now. And so that way you will know as a leader, where you're at a point of time. You can then say, is this a good thing where we're at now, or should I be worried? Now, as we come down further here, this is really what matters in the next section of this page to our leaders. And it comes back down to outcomes and management. And so for us in Jira Align, we've heavily emphasized the idea of objectives and key results. If you haven't read the book by John Doerr, Measure What Matters, highly encourage you to do it. It will kind of give you an insight in terms of what our thinking is here. But the idea is that as leaders, we care less about the work being done and more about the outcomes being achieved. And for us, within Align, we put that heavy emphasis on building a series of objectives at each level. That way teams can both tell us how they feel they're doing, and we can measure at each level how we think we're doing against achieving our overall outcomes as an organization. That first part here gives us our heat map. That heat map gives us the ability to say, as each quarter rolls on, notice we have PI5, PI6, PI7. We can see how we've done overall against our scores. And so in this case, we can say, hey, we were overall as an organization, well, we're okay. But, and we did all right, kind of building things out in PI5. Now, PI6, we're not doing so hot right now. We've got a lot of progress we're making, but you know what? Maybe we're moving in the wrong direction. And it gives us the ability to start asking those questions. Again, as we think about OKRs, our goal here is about the impacts we're making versus the delivery of said widgets that we're doing. So here, this is where leaders can start focusing on that. And then down below here, you also have this construct of an OKR tree, which allows you to do that diving in. You can understand understand our goals to our objectives, find out, hey, capitalizing on emerging technology is ultimately linked to this team objective of grow Android daily active users. You can see that nesting relationship here. So as an executive, this is where I can go to start, one, talking about where we're at, but also starting to say, what am I trying to accomplish? And that's just ultimately what you start seeing here is ultimately a manifestation of what we want to try to achieve. So with that in mind, we have an idea. Let's say we know that we're, overall, we're trying to capitalize on emerging technology trends. So our organization has that kind of go figure that out. So now what we can do is start figuring out, well, how are we going to do that? That's where really the backbone of any strong agile organization comes in. And that manifests through the usage of a backlog. So let's go take a look at the backlogs in Align and talk about building objects to put in here. So I'm going to come over into our backlog here, and actually I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually reduce I'll keep our time at where it is. Actually, I'm going to remove it. Indecisive this morning, I apologize. And so let's take a look at here. So right now, what I'm looking at is the backlog for Jira Align. So every program has its own backlog, every team has its own backlog, and every portfolio has its own backlog. And so as we think about this, what I'm looking at right now is going to be the feature backlog. But let's say I want to move up and I want to actually go take a look at my portfolio backlog. What are the epics here? Because typically, if we're thinking about our storyline, we've got our strategy, we're probably building out our epics here. And here I can actually start manifesting my 1 to n list of epics that we have for this particular group. In this case, I can see that interface 5, language model management, that is my #1 priority. So just like any good backlog, I'm going to be showing you a priority 1 to n. And within here, I can then start capturing all the information I need on this. So as I click on here, this is where I can capture all the data I have on my objects themselves. I can actually be able to go through and classify it against time. I can associate it with different intake forms, so I can go in and identify what are the things I want to capture around it. There's a lot of things I can do with an epic, but the big thing I bring this up is that this is the home for where you'll be able to essentially manage it in its flow of things within the system. And so as we think about this, we're building a backlog of epics. That's fantastic. But the thing is we have to manage that flow of epics. So from the same view, you can move into what we consider is our Kanban view. And so if I click over here on my right-hand side, I'm going to see Kanban. I usually go to, it's in our documentations, it's called process step flow. I like to rename this to Kanban flow because it's really what it is. And what it's going to manifest for me is it's going to manifest me this view that allows me to talk about, actually assess a Kanban flow for those work items. So for me in the system, as I think about, I created this strategy. Now I can start dropping in new epics into my unassigned column. I can start saying, well, okay, I want to do this. And I think this might be a good idea. This might be a great hypothesis to invest in. And then my goal here is to start moving that across my backlog. I'm starting to, again, as we're going, I'm starting to move those across so that way I can go in and say, am I accomplishing the things I need to accomplish along the way? One of the neat things I love about our backlog is, again, this is purely a manifestation of the data that's on an object. And so you can actually go in too and be able to understand things such as, hey, I've got 6 items in reviewing right now. Let's say I have an opportunity to move something to analyzing. I can go in and say, is this thing ready? And I can click this show exit criteria button. It'll actually tell me, hey, what is it I need to have done before I can move it into analyzing? Oh, I need to have a lean canvas approved. Oh, I need to have initial budget approved. These are things that can be customized by any organization, but basically allow you to set those soft guardrails to say, hey, before we keep progressing this forward, have we done our due diligence? So for us building this out, one of the things we're doing as an organization within Align is we're taking those large strategic ideas, we're breaking them down into epics, and we're starting to break them down. We're starting to understand them through moving them through our Kanban. And as work moves through a Kanban and it eventually gets to what I consider my portfolio backlog, that's when we can start doing things like associating work with time. As we start associating work with time, we can then start doing things like building roadmaps. So let me show you a little bit about how this kind of manifests itself into a roadmap. Because ultimately, in the end, strategy creates a backlog, but I need to be able to visualize that backlog. And the best way to do that is through a roadmap. let's take a step in our next part of our journey, and that's going to be talking about building a roadmap. So here, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you this view. And actually, I'm going to add one lens in. If you're like, whoa, what's all this? Let me go ahead and add my lens in. So I'm going to add, usually I look at the current and the next couple quarters or PIs ahead to help me visualize my roadmap. So what you're seeing here is the mobile program across 3 PIs, and I'm going to be looking at certain levels of objects. Here in Align, what's kind of nice is I have the ability to look at different types of objects. I can look at my epics, I can look at my features, I can look at my themes. I can also look at nested objects. I can say, give me my portfolio epics by themes, or what I'm looking at now, my features by portfolio epics. So as I start planning out those portfolio epics, and I say, AI for approved call center interactions. Let's say that came through our funnel. I've gone ahead and says, yep, we're going to do this in PIs. Actually, let me move into this, the PI view. I'm going to do this in PI 5, 6, and 7. Cool, we're all aligned on that. We're going to do that in 5, 6, and 7. I can now start breaking that epic down into features. And as I do that and start tagging those, if I expand this, I can start seeing the different features I'm starting to build out and where those fall. And if I want to, I can start kind of moving those around within the timeline and saying, well, this is really how this is going to manifest itself. This is how I'm going to accomplish the hypothesis that, try to answer that hypothesis, to accomplish the goal of that AI for improved call center is going to be these items and this one and these. So it gives me that ability to set that up. And then what's nice is I can go in and communicate that now back to my leadership team. Because ultimately, in the end, in order to start actually executing on something, you've got to have a plan. And this is that first inclination of a plan, is that, hey, we've got an idea of what we want to do now, what we want to do next, and what we want to do later. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So roadmaps give you that strong ability to go in, move data around, be able to understand how data looks in relation to others. What's another nice thing you can do here too is, and this kind of goes into our planning we'll be doing, I can also go down and say, well, let's take a look, and I'm just going to look at 1 quarter's worth of work. So let's say PI 5, and I only want to see the features. I only want to see the one type of object. So if I come in here, this kind of gives me an idea of, here is PI 5, here are all the sprints, and here are all the features I'm planning on working on this PI. And those areas of time, these represents, I'm saying for, in this case, automation, G12 automation, I'm only planning on working on that for 4 sprints out of the 6 that are in this PI. So it gives me the ability to communicate some of this. And what's kind of nice too, see these little numbers here? These actually represent the stories in the sprints that they are planned for. So as I work on things, I can also get ideas of, hey, maybe where I'm off, or where I'm not aligned with my teams. They're doing work here, but we weren't going to start until here. Or even other cases where, let's actually, a good example for this, if I bring up an old PI, this is where all of a sudden I've got work that would be showing up potentially in a prior PI that is not. So notice all these red ones here. It's like, oh, hey, we had work that was starting here, but we weren't set to start on the work till here. So it starts giving me visibility in terms of, hey, are we working on the right stuff right now? All right, so we've built a roadmap. So we had a strategy. We broke that strategy into epics. We moved those epics to our backlog, started breaking down the features, and ultimately we built a roadmap. That roadmap is an input that we have with that backlog of features for what we would consider our planning exercise. And for us, that planning exercise manifests itself in the form of a plan that we build. So I want to show you a little bit about what this plan looks like. So within Align, if you're familiar again with Scaled Agile, this plan program board is going to look very familiar to something in that realm, because honestly, is a good, regardless of framework you're in, it's a good way of visualizing the work you're planning on doing. So let me introduce you to our program board. So for any PI or any quarter that you're working with, you can look at a particular program and say, all right, let's see what we're all doing. How are we all coordinating with each other? And in this case, I've got the mobile program, and I'm across the mobile program, I've got 5 different teams. Across these different teams, I can start visualizing 3 different things. I can visualize the features that I'm planning, that I'm working on as a team, and when I plan to get them done. I can visualize the dependencies that I have on other people, and I can visualize the objectives I'm trying to accomplish. And so let's take a look at what that means. When we look here on the board, let's take a look at Baltimore's row. These rectangles here are a representative of what we consider the features we're planning on doing. So if I click on 1636, it's going to open up and it's going to say, hey, this is a quick view of a feature for platform component performance and sizing. And it gives me the ability to understand what work is associated with it. I can see the stories down here. I can then go in and say what teams are working on it. And I can also set when, as my team, I plan on getting this done. Right now, I'm planning on getting it done in sprint 23. And so for each team, they have this ability to identify what their work is and when they want to get that done. Now, as you look here, you'll also see these little, like I'm from Detroit, so I like to call these the Chevy symbols. These are the little things, it's the rectangles with the edges cut out. These would represent our dependencies. Here's a dependency that another team has on this. We've got upgrade, complete green equivalent regression. Right now we can see that team A depends on Baltimore. So team Alpha is needing us for something, and they need this by sprint 24. So we know it says, hey, we've got to get this completed by that time frame, or for that case, we know that we need to have a conversation with them about it. And these little diamonds here at the top, these represent what we consider our objectives. These are the things that we're hoping to accomplish along the way. Now, one neat thing that you'll see come across the line is one, if I hover over a work item, let's see if I can find a good one. Notice how I hover over this dependency and all of a sudden that dependency highlights, but then I also see a feature in Baltimore Cowboys and Houston all light up too. This is representative of the fact that these are all associated with the same feature. Baltimore Cowboys and Houston are all working on this feature. If I click on it, you'll actually know all three teams are listed on this because they all have stories associated with it in this case. And so each team can then determine when they're going to get that work done. It just so happens to be in my demo data, they're all getting it done in sprint 27. But there are also situations like, let's see here. See if I find a good one here. Here's a good one. Notice here where I've got, in this case, I've got an objective and it's got different features on it. This is a nice way where for an objective, and an objective can be completed through multiple different features. And so I can say, hey, this objective, although it may complete in sprint 28, I'm getting work done in sprint 24 and 25 and 26, all associated with completing this one. So this gives us the ability to, again, lay out that plan. And one of the things you're going to find as you start actually essentially tracking progress, the program board actually provides some really good mechanisms for thinking about how we're actually doing against our plan. And it has to do with the uses of color. So you'll notice we've got a lot of green over here. We've got some check marks in there. Green is traditionally good. That means, hey, we're done with that. As you start moving over in these last two sprints, you're going to notice some different colorations. Blue in this case is actually something that says, hey, we're progressing, all's good. But as you'd imagine, you start getting into orange, yellow, red, we start seeing what we consider planning issues. When we deal with an orange item, it says, hey, this is something that's an FYI. Some stories are not assigned to any team or any sprint. So if I come down here, I can see, oh, hey, I've got no sprints here targeted for some of these. So it makes me think that, you know what, we have a plan to get this done by sprint 27, but how are we to that? Again, nothing that we have to go back and figure out right away, but it says, hey, FYI, there could be a risk here. Now, if you get into yellow, you start getting into areas where there is actually an active risk around something. It says, hey, there's an open risk. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see, oh, we have high team turnover. This was an accepted risk that we have. It's still open. So it's going to be basically saying associated with this feature, you're going to have some risk you got to worry about. And then finally, as you imagine, red means we've got a problem. Usually for me, as I coach my companies I'm working with, is I say, orange and yellow. Yellow is more of an FYI. Orange is you probably got to take some action soon. Red is you need to take action now because there's something wrong right now. So this is basically says, hey, some of the dependencies are scheduled for sprint past the feature due date. So it says, oh crap, this one is committed by sprint 28. We're saying we're going to get this done by sprint 27. That doesn't make any sense. That can't work. So for us, we've got to align those up. And so that gives you the ability, and to me, it talks about removing the noise. When I'm looking at a program board, I don't have to worry about those things that are okay. Those, there might be something that someone needs to bring up, awesome. But as someone who's looking at, making sure we're moving forward well, I care about those colors. It also gives that autonomy to the teams. Teams own their destiny on this one. And so for me, I only care about where there's problems and where I can help. And so that way teams don't feel like I'm micromanaging their work, but when there are issues coming up, let's talk about it. So this gives us the ability to build out our plan, and also if you're ever if you're in here and you're ever curious, you can go in and find out what do those colors mean by looking at our color wheel. You could also go through and you might be like, Mark, those are so little small things. Like, how do I read this? We have different views on this program board, and so if you click on this little hierarchy thing here, you can look at what we consider our normal view. It'll actually give you the titles of those objects too, which is kind of nice. So you can move back and forth, so that way you can kind of zoom out and see a wider view. Because again, for me, as a prior RTE, I would care about those colors. The work items themselves, I don't need to know about as much, but I need to know about where do we have some risk and where can I help? So we built a plan. So think about this, where we've been so far. We've gone in, we had a strategy we created some objectives there that built ourselves out a backlog of portfolio epics that we started moving through our Kanban and started breaking down and road mapping out we want to go. Based on that roadmap, we came up with a plan. Now we can actually start tracking our progress here. And as we think about that, we have one of the most powerful places that I find in Align is going to be what's considered our program room. And that program room is a place that allows us to be able to understand and kind of get a one-stop view for how everything is going in a PI. Here's our program room again for the mobile program for PI5. And what it's going to tell me, it's going to give me all the data I need to know what's going on right now in the program. It tells me how many features, stories, and points I've got associated with. It gives me an idea of my overall progress as well. How much time do we have left in the PI? How am I doing on my objectives and my stories? I can also see things like overall progress by teams too, saying, hey, where do I need to worry about? Looks like, in this case, Houston, with only 12 days left, I'm a little worried that Houston is only at 70% of the way. So it gives me the ability in my next scrum of scrums to go to them and say, hey, do you all need help? And is there any teams here who, maybe in this case, Cowboys and Washington might have some extra capacity to help there? I can also understand how much I've loaded into this PI and how much that load equates to the different teams. One thing I can see automatically right off the bat is I've already made a connection. Houston right now is at 70% of the way complete. They were the most loaded down team in the beginning. They took on more work than they should have. And that's probably why they're behind. So I can start gleaning these insights just from looking at the data as it's projected in here. Along with this, I can see all the work that I'm working on throughout the PI. I can see where we're at across the different sprints that we're in here. We can see, hey, we're in sprint 27 now. We've got 17 out of the 37 stories that are across all our teams completed. We're moving pretty good at this point. Nothing I've got to worry about at the moment. And then we can capture a lot of the metadata around this period of time. Talk about any actions we have, impediments, risks, dependencies, and then also our objectives as they relate here. One of my favorite features on our program board or our program room has to do with how we talk about misaligned stories. So misaligned stories are a really fascinating thing because here it says you have 51 misaligned stories. And what this means is that these stories are part of the PI. They were worked on in a sprint, but they belong to features that are not in this PI. And so for me as maybe a product manager, I'm not necessarily saying it's bad that we worked on these things, but I'm fascinated to understand what we're working on here. Because if we are working on stuff in the PI that is not associated with the goals we have for this PI, I have questions, and if we've got a lot, in this case, I have 51 stories out of my 351. That's not terrible. That's 1/7. But if that number was 200 stories, I'd have questions because I'd be curious if I'm going to get my goals done for this PI. So again, my program room gives me that ability to kind of get a kind of a bird's eye view and connect some dots that maybe I hadn't been able to do in the past. Now, now we're through execution. There's a couple other things I want to show you here, just so you can get an idea of some of the things that you can be doing both during planning and throughout. And that has to do with things such as the tracking of metadata on work. And that metadata is associated with things like risks and dependencies. So we could plan out a feature and get it all done, awesome. But the thing is that's wishful thinking. Many times work has risk associated with it. There's also dependencies there too. So at Align, we give you that ability to help kind of understand and track those. So let's talk about risks real quick. So with risks, we give you the ability to identify risks and then do what we call roam those risks. So within Align, we'll allow teams to essentially grab a feature or an epic, and an associated risk with it. Once you do that, we've got to kind of triage that risk. That risk has got to move its way through, from an open unassigned state to let's figure out where it lands. Is it we ultimately want to figure out if it falls in one of 4 statuses. Is it resolved, meaning hey, it's not a risk anymore? Awesome, that's the best type of risk. Is it owned, meaning we have no idea what we're doing for this yet, but we've got someone on it who's going to go figure that out for us. Is it accepted, which means hey, we don't know, this is still a risk, but we don't know how to solve for it? Or is it mitigated, meaning hey, we do think we have a stopgap, but the risk is still out there? This gives me a view so that way through the PI, during planning, I can get an idea of what risks exist, where they live, and at what status they're at. I can also understand things like additional data around their open versus closed status, the actual risk of occurrence and the impact of that occurrence. So this gives me a visual view of how my risks play out. So risks are one angle here, but the other thing we want to look at when we think about work is going to be what we call dependencies. And to me, dependencies in Jira Align is probably one of the most powerful tools in Align that it has to offer, because it treats dependencies as what I like to call first-class objects. It's not just a work item link. It's a actual handshake agreement that has a workflow in Align. And what I mean by that is, let me click here on this object. This is a dependency that has moved through its workflow. It started in a non-committed state, it got committed, and then it was ultimately completed. So for us, a dependency lives at this level. So as we're progressing on in our work, one of the things we can use in Align is called our dependency maps. Dependency maps are pretty powerful because what they do is they help you visualize your dependencies. And I'm going to show you just a couple of my favorite ones here. So as you identify dependencies between work, you can start helping to make better decisions around dependencies. Because again, for me, you can never fully eliminate dependencies. You can only better manage them and help reduce them. And so if I go to my maps, there's a couple of views I want to show you. First one's going to be what I consider my grid view. The grid view is a good tool to be able to say, from a bird's eye view, where do our dependencies live in relation to teams? So in this case, I can see that Chargers have 2 dependencies on Baltimore. Cowboys has 3 dependencies on Baltimore. So I can start seeing here, hey, how does that relationship live? And we're only looking here within this time frame as it lives here. And so what's fascinating for me is I can start looking and saying, hey, are there any patterns we've got to worry about? Are there anything that says, hey, you know what? There's enough dependencies between these teams all the time that we say, you know what? Maybe we should think about how do we do some cross training? How do we think about helping these teams improve? So dependencies, our dependency matrix helps us see this. The other one that I like to show is what I like to call our dependency donut. This is going to be our wheel view. The wheel view is going to give you a visual view of all the dependencies and their relation to each other. And you can see here where the origins or the supporting comes from. You can see these large areas. So you can see Tigers. Tigers is one that is definitely in some need for dependencies, whether or not they're dependent on them or whether or not they need it from they're needed from others. So if I go to Tigers, whoops. Where did my Tigers go? Oh, here we go. So if I go to Tigers, I can see that there are a number of dependencies here that others need from Tigers, but also Tigers need stuff from others as well. So there's a lot. Mostly here, though, I see there's more that others need from them. So again, gives me an idea of should we start some conversations on cross training. So going back to this aspect of as we're thinking about things, we've looked at those dependencies. So as you think about our storyline, strategy to epics, to roadmaps, to plan, to execution, we've been managing this all the way. We've been getting a lot of stuff done, but ultimately in the end, is it worth it? Did we got the right stuff done? And for us, this is where we kind of go full circle on our story and talk about this ability to connect us back to strategy. So as teams get their work done, we ultimately need to go back and say, does this actually connect back to our strategy? And in Align, we do this again through that form of objectives. And so as we build out those objectives, you saw it on the program board, you can connect work to objectives. We can go back and actually say, let's take a look at this new objectives tree that you're seeing in Align, and actually take a look and say, well, how does our objectives relate back to it? Are we making progress where we want to? So in this case, I'm going to be looking at a series of different objectives. I'm going to be looking at my program objectives right now. And I can actually understand what program objectives there are and team objectives, but most importantly, I really love this ability to be able to look at work progress. And what work progress allows me to do is it says, well, you've associated so much work to this. How much have you gotten done of that? And then ultimately, as you're checking in on these objectives over time, how does that relate to how much work you've gotten done? I think one of my favorite scenarios, let's see if I can find, I don't think I can find it in this example. If I go up one tier, I might be able to find it. But is when you start seeing a situation where you start seeing oh, here we go, great example. Become a market leader in mobile investment. So right now, from an objectives perspective, we are on track. We're scoring a 0.8. We're kicking it. We're hitting on our key results. Everything looks really good on this one. And the one neat thing is we've only done 1 out of the 4 items associated with this. At this point now, I can start thinking about that big goal within business agility of reducing waste, reducing unnecessary work. And says, hey, is this good enough? Do we need to continue on with these things? And so now I can have a conversation that probably I never had before, because I have this ability to actually connect back my outcomes to my execution, saying, maybe we don't. Maybe we're in a good spot. And so this is what leads me down that direction. So this is what kind of completes our full circle as we think about the Jira Align story. The last thing I want to show you is kind of something outside of this story, but it's something that is just the final piece that's people always have questions on. And this goes back into what we consider the integration between Jira Align and team tools. So Jira Align today integrates with 3 different team tools. It can integrate with Trello, it can integrate with Jira, as you'd imagine, and it also integrates with Azure DevOps. And so I'm going to show you just, when you do integrate 2 systems together, you begin to see a couple different things that start popping up. First off, once you integrate an item, and here's an example one I've got. It's going to be called Find the Arrow of Apollo. And one thing you're going to notice right off the bat is once we've integrated, you're going to notice this view in Jira button. And what it does is it's basically going to create you a direct link to that object in Jira. And when you're in here, now you've got a connection. I've got this BSG1 that I've connected to. That is the exact same item here as this one. And so I can pass information back and forth, not all the information in Jira back and forth, but just the right amount of information. And the thing I like to show in this one that's usually the really neat thing is that one of the issues that teams struggle with in Jira is they struggle with the ability to understand direction and really the why behind the work they're doing. And Jira Align is not designed necessarily to have all the team members in it. And so it kind of stinks for them if they can't see that connection to the greater mission and vision within their own team tool of Jira. And so for Jira Align, we actually help you easily see that through an aspect of a Y button we have on all of our objects. So I click that, gives me the ability to see how this ties back. But again, if I'm in Jira, how do I see that? Well, through an integration, we can actually pass this exact same information down to Jira. So that way, as a team member, I don't have to go to Jira Align. If I come back over to this object, you're going to notice, hey, I've got this Y button information. This is information sent from Jira Align to Jira. So that way now, as a team member on a team, I can go look in Jira and understand how this is playing out in relation to my organization. And so it gives me that ability to understand kind of what the business case is for this. How did this get ranked from a priority? What are the things that drove it? So again, one of those kind of cool, meaningful things that you can start using from an integration perspective to hopefully help your teams do better work, which is ultimately the goal. All right, so that was a quick tour down demo lane. That was the extent of my demo. And so the only other thing I'll say is before we open it up for some questions is I always say in terms of community, which is a community event, from what I've been told from our community team is that the Jira Align folks here in Atlassian are some of the most active ones in community. So you'll see my pretty face in there. You'll see others. We are always in there answering questions and having dialogue with folks. So if you're ever curious about anything, go into the Jira Align space. We have a lot of good conversations going. So I always encourage folks to do that. And if you'd love to connect, take a picture of this. That's my LinkedIn profile. We'll get you there. Always happy to answer questions outside of here as well. So, so with that said, I'd love to open it up for some questions and happy to talk about anything or show off any other functionality people have.
Thank you, Mark. I think that was a wonderful demo. I also got to learn a lot about Jira Align. Thank you so much.
There you go. Excellent.
We have a few questions. Let's start with the community members question first, and then I'll pick up the leaders question. So I have first question from Ismail, who's asking, is there a minimum number of team members to use this methodology or framework?
Mhm.
Sorry for the stammer, but yeah, any answer to
Yeah,
that?
so that great question on that one. And so Jira Align is definitely something that if you're an organization of like 200 people, I typically say, nope, you know what? We've got tools like advanced roadmaps with Jira that do a great job. There's some things you got to do in there to make it work similar, but it definitely not going to be worth the price tag that's on Jira Align. It is a higher premium product because it is designed at that enterprise. For me, typically what I look at here is there's usually an aspect of anywhere, from, I don't know, probably 40 plus teams in an organization who are needing to work together. That's where you start getting into the point where Jira Align becomes a very valuable tool, because all of a sudden one of the big things you see with Jira Align is that connection of teams that need to work together, and how do we aggregate their data together. So if you're most of my customers, I'll just speak from experience, anywhere from 1,000 people to 25,000 people. I've seen be successful with Align, but like I said, I think there's going to be an ROI for many customers. As a license for Jira Align runs about $1,000, so it's per year. So that's a hefty price tag. But when you're dealing with that management of how work is done at large organizations, that typically can be justified at that level.
Okay. Next one is from Kailash, Shashi Tharan. He's asking about, if enterprise and portfolio not configured, can I start creating program level backlog?
Definitely. And actually, some of the ways we actually first start out Jira Align, so when we work with a customer, we actually don't even look at portfolio and enterprise right off the bat, because we figure, the idea is that as you're progressing to portfolio and enterprise, you really need to have the good practices at the program and team. And so for us, initially in Align, you can configure it just to be a program. You can have multiple programs that are managed within it. And then from there, as you start getting enough programs in there, you can start thinking about, well, how do we aggregate this up, and thinking about how we organize around a portfolio. So yes, you can 100% do that.
Right. Now many questions are from Subramanyam. Subramanyam, do you want to call out the questions yourself? You can turn on the mic.
Yeah, thank you, Tamanna. Actually, I have pretty few questions. I'm completely new to this Jira Align. And when we speak about 4 layers of availability, so how does the estimations work out? Is it like we have to go with the different estimations at strategy level, or enterprise level, or portfolio level, or team level, or is it a single kind of estimations? Like, is it
Great
story
question.
points? Yeah, so please.
So at a team level, typically there's story points, and that's usually how we look at it. We also can allow for like tasking out hours and things like that. And then as you move up into higher level objects, like what you consider like a feature or portfolio epic, we do allow different sizing techniques or estimation techniques. So you can deal with points, you can deal with t-shirt sizes, you can deal with member weeks, depending on where an organization is at in their journey and understanding how to size work. And so for us, each program and portfolio can have a technique that they use. And so it is one of those things where once you get in there, we actually have this thing in the back end called estimation conversion. And it helps you to think about how that relates at some level to time. So that way, as you start thinking about it, one area I didn't show you in here is we have a whole financials module that talks about things like spend. We ultimately help you equate that to capacity, and that capacity to, well, hey, if a team costs $10,000 to run every 2 weeks, how much is it actually costing us to get 2 out of our 10 story points done? So those are things that we break in. So yes, we can break out to multiple estimation techniques along the way to fit that level of the organization.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. On top of that, we generally, when we set up the Jira projects, right? So either the Jira admin or the Jira project admin will work together to define the workflow as part of the requirement, etc. So is it the same with the Jira Align, where the initial point of contact will be the Jira admin or any other POC?
Great question. So typically what's going to happen is that your Jira Align admin and your Jira admin either are the same person or they're two people that are closely knit together, because the workflows that you define in Jira are going to have an impact in Align. And part of the things that you'll find as you come into Align is that we strongly encourage an organization, particularly if you're in the same program together, so that team of teams, to really look at that systems level thinking of how do we all work together in a similar fashion. And so you'll start seeing us talk about, well, we may want all these teams within this team of teams to be using a similar workflow. Doesn't mean that each team of teams has to use the same workflow, but within a team of teams, we really want to encourage that. So that's where we see that as you start building in, and teams today are kind of doing each individual project may have their own at some level, or there's a standard one. As teams start to onboard into Jira Align, there's a whole process that we typically encourage that Jira Align admins go through, working with their Jira admins to say, all right, if you've got to do, we need to do these 3 things to bring you on, including things like understanding the issue types you use, the workflows you have, the types of fields and validations you're using. So that way we can ensure that we can get good bi-directional syncing between the 2 products. And so there is definitely some conversations that we'll have around workflows. So that way, 1, make it easier on your Jira admins to hopefully align on more of a consistent workflow. But then 2, that consistency lends itself into Align to give you kind of a good organizational view.
Sounds fantastic. And sorry, I have 2 more questions if time permits, and if
oh yeah, go for it.
users. All right. I mean, we have a lot of reports in Jira software. So when it comes to Jira Align, given the multi-layer estimations or the breakdown of the workflow requirement, right? So can we build a customized report or reports as part of the organization, the management requirement, given the visibilities at the strategy level?
Great question. So in Align, we've got probably about 180 reports that are throughout the tool. And for us, one of our first things is as we think about those requirements from like a leadership team, goes back to that, let's talk about what they're trying to accomplish. And sometimes there's some good, sometimes they say, oh, we're trying to do this. And we're like, let's go do this report in Align. And then we try to see if that will work. If that doesn't work, we do offer a functionality. It's called Enterprise Insights. It's essentially our BI solution for Align, which essentially exports all of our data into a database that then you can go in and mine using something like Power BI, Tableau, or something like that. Many customers who are looking for much more customized reports will use that by leveraging our data in our Enterprise Insights solution to actually build those reports.
Okay, Mark, I have one final question. I'm so sorry. See, we have the APAC features stories. How does the requirement gets breakdown from top to, from layer 4 to layer 1?
So for us within Align, as we think about it, is that we have up to, I think it's 6 levels of objects. You have themes in Align that can break down into portfolio epics. Those portfolio epics break down into what I didn't show you today, but it can be broken down to a layer that's usually hidden. It's called a capability. That capability can be broken down into a feature, and that feature can be broken down into a story, and that story can of course be broken down into subtasks. And so for us, as we think about that connection, that's usually how that structure happens. For us, between Jira Align and Jira, we will sync your features, your stories, and your subtasks into Jira Align and can bidirectionally sync those. For those objects above that, the capability, portfolio, epic, theme, those are objects that ultimately then live in Jira Align, and that's where typically they start their journey out. They start coming through there, and then when you're ready, you're building work out, sending it to Jira, and then teams are building stories around it, and you start seeing that come back. So that's where you kind of see that comes down from the higher level ideas, but then once they merge between the 2, teams start adding work in, and then we get visibility in a Jira Align to what they're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for that, for your time and queries.
Yeah, Mark, we still have a few more questions because we are over time. Do you mind if we
I've got some more time, so yep, I can totally hang on.
So Vishnu, if you can ask your questions, go ahead and ask that, and then I'll pick up Vinod's question.
Sure. Thank you, Tamanna. And I do have, I think, 3, 4 questions, but yeah. First one is like, can it be integrated with multiple Jira instances? Like, since it involves multiple teams, so if there are multiple Jira instances where we capture our epics and stories, can it pull data from all these instances?
100%. Yep. That's part of its goal too, is hopefully aggregate all those disparate instances together to give you a single view.
If so, how many instances we can connect? Is there any limitation, or it could be multiple?
I've not come across a limitation yet. I know of customers who have upwards to 10 instances that they're connecting up to now, and these are large enterprise instances. But I've not come across a limitation here. We can spin up multiple connectors, which are basically services in the background. And right at this point, it's unlimited from that perspective. We will have to think about depending on, like, if you say I have 100 instances, we'll have to talk about the performance impacts of that. But I've not come across an upper limit on this yet.
That's great. Okay. And how about the resource management, like a forecasting project? So would I get a live view of the impact? Say if I put like 5 resources on a project, and if I adjust that to 6 or 7, would I be able to see a live forecasting view? Like I think we had this in portfolio.
Yeah, so you would see it wouldn't necessarily be the same as what you see in portfolio or advanced roadmaps today with the kind of the breakdown and capacity planning there, but it's very similar. And what it will do is it will show you a view of, as you look at things like higher level objects like epics and even features, you can go into what is considered our forecasting page and start talking about how much time you need. And then what it will start doing is, assuming you've got only so much capacity, as you start allocating that time, you start seeing objects down below it in the priority order start turning red, because all of a sudden it says you don't have capacity for this, you don't have capacity. And so if you, to your point, you adjust that time, all of a sudden an item might free up because it says, wow, I'm only going to put 10 people on this one, or this much capacity on this one, and thus I can enable myself to work on this one again. So that's where you do have some of that functionality with our forecasting.
Perfect. Thank you. My last question is like, so what are the best use cases I need to consider Jira Align, when you compare with portfolio?
Complexity. That's going to be the big one. So for me, most of the time with organizations, Jira Portfolio or Jira Advanced Roadmaps, as it's been rebranded, that tool is fantastic to help you build the structure and to build the team dynamics, as we know. The one thing is when you start getting into dozens, if not hundreds of teams, there's even technical limitations around, I think it's like 5,500 rows, things like that you start hitting in portfolio or advanced roadmaps. That's where we start seeing some issues start landing, and being able to eliminate the noise in there. And so Align will give you that ability to actually kind of have what I like to think of very distinct entities of teams that align, that give you the ability to aggregate data. So for me, like I said, if I had a customer that was, maybe 400 or 500 people, and they had, a couple dozen teams, I'd be like, don't use Jira Align. It's not, you're bringing a sledgehammer to something where you just need a little hammer, or whatever the thing is, whatever the analogy is. But basically, it's only in those situations where you're starting to deal with complexity that is just purely unmanageable with some basic Jira tools. And you're also dealing with heavy dependencies, heavy risks, and you're also trying to connect that back up to things like objectives and key results. If those are things that are big in your organization, that's another big win for that one as well.
Perfect. That's great. So thank you. So I think that answers my question.
And last question from Vinod. He's asking, can we sync all custom field data from Jira to Jira Align?
Unfortunately, no. And it's intentionally done that way too. So in Jira Align, we have a ton of fields that we feel are, again, based off of industry and experience, that we feel are the things you should be capturing. But we do allow you to have some custom fields. But in terms of the syncing between them, what we do is we say, you know what, if teams are using custom fields and they want to capture the stuff with it in their world, awesome. Let them do that. And we can work with them to capture all that. But in Jira Align, we only need the basic information. And then when it comes down to things like features or Jira epics, same sort of premise plays out. In Jira Align, we're going to have a bunch of information that we care about from a business perspective there. We will send the basic information down to Jira Align, but then also things like that Y button information I shared with you. So we work within the limitations of the current Jira API, and even within that, knowing that we can grab some custom fields in there, what we do is we truly try to limit it down to just what's the information that's needed to help us make decisions on both ends.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
You bet.
Great, great. Thank you so much for tackling all the questions and a wonderful demo, Mark. And with that, we come to the end of the session. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope you had a insightful session. Looking forward to seeing you back, Mark, sometime later. And
Sounds good. Yeah, please reach out if you have any questions, folks. I'm happy to always answer.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining. See you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Tamanna. Thank you.
Thank
Mark.
you.
Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Tamanna. Bye.
So.